So let's get the history on Dr. Ayers here. What's your background? Where you're from? How you grew up? How you got tricked into working on the large animal side of the veterinary industry? Let's just start there.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica and Bill, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. But I'm originally from north central Montana, a little town called Fort Benton, in between pretty much the central part of the state, 75 miles south of the Canadian border, but just about dead center in the state, east and west. Graduated high school there, went to college in Montana. Actually, after I went to vet school, came back to Fort Benton and practiced for a little period of time. Ended up started my own practice in a little town called Big Sandy, right in the same county, Choteau County. Practiced there for a number of years, and then I've actually been over here in Idaho for 20 years. So came over here and partnered up with a classmate of mine, and early 2000s, so 2003, I believe. And then I taught veterinary students at the University of Idaho. There's a remote campus here in Caldwell. And I taught production medicine out in the field, both dairy, beef, sheep and goats. It was strictly a food animal facility. Most of my career has been mixed animal practice until once I went to the university, and then since then, I've been just strictly on the farm animal side. Been with Elanco for just 5 years now, 5 years in April, as a technical consultant on the beef team. And so how did I get involved? It's just one of those. Sometimes I think some people, they kind of pick a career path or something, and for me, it was just something I was always going to do. Even from the time I was a little kid, my grandfather had a ranch, farm and ranch. My dad worked for different ranchers and farmers as we grew up, and then when we finally moved to town, when there was a whole passel load of kids, then it was just something that I was going to do. It seems like when you grow up around them, you're always trying to. You have to take care of the sick ones. You have to try and make adequate housing for everybody, and it's just something I was going to do. So, there wasn't an individual thing that triggered it. Just always in the back of my mind. I took a different path than most people. I didn't go to vet school till I was 30 years old. Had a family, wife, and 3 kids. I started out, went 1 year to school right out of high school, and life happened. And next thing you know, I've got a family and decided to go back to school. So
it kept you out of trouble, though. So you had to go to class. Then you were financially invested.
I was invested, yes, and you're exactly right. There's some stability. It makes it a little bit harder because you have family and you have other things to consider than yourself. But at the same time, it also made it easier because I saw some of the 23, 24, 25-year-olds, single folks that were, still doing single things, right? And
a little bit distracted, yeah.
Yeah, and with the family, I went home. I made sure that. So one of the things I do tell a little bit on myself is at the end of the first semester, I was either going to be a veterinarian or I was going to be married, and probably not both unless I changed my ways. It's very demanding, and you have to learn how to manage that time. And so I decided that my family was very, very important, and that wherever I ended up on the veterinary side, I ended up. And so I made sure that I did not do anything school related until 9 o'clock at night. So 9 o'clock till 1 o'clock in the morning, that was my time for school. Weekends were family time. Kids went to bed at 9 o'clock at night. That's why I chose that time. And the reality is it made me a better student because I studied what I needed to study to become a good veterinarian and not memorize facts. I learned how to learn, right? And I learned what was important, and that's what got me through. So, and it has served me well. I've tried to live my life that way of being a understanding what I need to know to keep moving forward and getting better all the time. So
Absolutely, and you touched on an important piece there, which veterinarians still struggle with today, is that work-life balance. It's almost where you have to designate your time for this and that, and you have to be cognizant of it. You can't just kind of fly by the seat of your pants and expect it to work out.
Yeah, and it's difficult, and you have to balance that. And your family is they're part of the system, right? So I can't tell you how many birthdays or anniversaries or whatever I've missed just because you get an emergency, and if you're the only guy in town, you got to go, and that's just how it is. Everybody understands it. I have 3 boys. People ask all the time, "Hey, are any of your boys going to be veterinarians, or are they veterinarians?" It's like, nope, they went to vet school when they were kids. They don't need to go now. So they all kind of see it. They liked it. I had one that worked for me for a long time, but it's very demanding, and not only going through school, but afterwards and trying to reach that balance. And but it's very rewarding at the same time. So there's a lot of things that we have done as a family as part of practice. They all have spent their time with me and in the truck, and my wife, she's spent her time with me in the clinic. And so quality
time, I'm sure.
Well, you learn to make the best of it, right? So yeah, we were going to go somewhere, but we got to go pull a calf. So we go do that, and then we have fun, and we get a live one, and everybody's happy, and we go on about our business and for the rest of the evening or whatever it is. I mean, you have to learn how to take it in stride and make things a positive. So.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess my first question here would be, so you gave us a great, background story, why you are in this position today, pretty much. How would you say, though, that over time, how has the food animal industry, and then specifically the veterinary industry, changed since you started practicing?
So one of the biggest things is choices. I mean, we have so many different products now compared to what we did when I started, especially in the antibiotic world. When I started, there was just a handful of choices on the food animal side. With the advent of some of the new and the ways that we use them. So metaphylaxis, that started with Mycotil back in the early 90s. And we never did that before, to any extent, but we had that, the Elanco got that label, and it made a big difference. Information, the access to information. When I started everything, you subscribed to some journals and you read everything you could to try and keep up. Now I punch it in on my phone. I mean, it's pretty amazing what you can do, what we have access to. Now there's a whole nother level of screening that you have to go through when you can punch information on your phone to make sure you got the right answer. But access to information is tremendous. What we've learned about the immune system, disease transmission, and every day we learn more and more about the immune system. We learn about more and more about the interactions between the immune system and the reproductive system. We always knew they were connected, but not to the degree that we understand today. So as we go forward, it's a young person starting out, there's more information to try and absorb, but at the same time, I think it helps on a day-to-day basis about how we navigate our way through, disease states and treatments and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Well, so let's move into the topic of the day, parasiticides. So let's start with the basics. Can you kind of explain why proper use of parasiticides is important, and really the financial impact that it can have on a guy's herd if it's not, prioritized?
Yeah, so there was a study that was done a few years ago looking at some of the economics of technology that we have on the farm animal side. So things like dewormers, implants, feed additives, some of those things that help help with performance and health. And this study looked at different angles. So from the cow-calf side, if we were to remove dewormers or lose dewormers, we would add about $165 to our break-even cost of selling a calf. So, that adds to a lot. One, it's average daily gain on calves. It's performance of cows, whether the cows breed back. So you add all those things, how many calves get born. When you add all that up, they came up with an estimate of about $165. All the way through from cow-calf through the stalker phase, backgrounder phase, and into the feedlot phase, they figure that just dewormers would add about $190 to the bottom line break-even point, if you look all the way through all the segments. So it can be very, very important. We do see some death loss. It's probably not as the death loss part of it from the calf side is not as big as maybe they see on the small ruminant side. So, where they have a lot more problems with resistance, but they also, the sheep and the goats have slightly different parasites that affect the animal in a different way. So, but we do see that. I mean, you can be in certain locations and you'll see death loss if you aren't using a good deworming program. So economically, it can be important. The extreme end, cows don't breed back because they're pulled down. Young stock mostly. Older cows are not nearly as affected. Mature cows, so say cows 4 years of age and older, are not usually as affected by internal parasites, with the exception of, say, liver flukes. Liver flukes don't care how old you are. They're gonna. If you're in an area that has them, there's damage that gets done every time they have an adult liver fluke migrating around or set up shop in the bile duct. So, with the exception of that one, intestinal, or what we call gastrointestinal parasites, so GIN for short, those have less of an effect on an adult animal than they do on young stock. So.
Okay.
So I guess, in our situation here at our farm, we're getting ready to start our fall calving. Yep. Some parts of the United States, will be doing that. Others are in the spring. So since we're going to have outside, inside reps that come from a variety of backgrounds and experience with large animal, and then also veterinarians and clinics, let's go through the perfect hypothetical situation with a cow-calf operation that calves in the spring. What would be for you the proper parasiticide protocol?
So you're not going to like this answer, but it's called that depends. Okay. and here's why. So there's a lot of things that we have to consider for a parasiticide protocol, and that's why we need to work with your local veterinarian. Parasites behave differently from north to south. So the same organism will behave slightly differently in Montana and North Dakota than it will in Texas. The same organism, even on the same latitude, will behave differently from the East Coast to the West Coast, depending on the amount of moisture and the temperature. And so parasites are very adapted to their location and the animals that they live in. So, as an example, we did some survey work just this last summer, and what we found was you could not, if I'm deworming too early, the parasites aren't even there, right? Mm-hmm. So we kind of think of, if we think about it as when we have rapidly growing green grass, we should have hatching and developing larvae out on the pasture. And I mean growing grass. So not just it's green out, right? But it needs to be growing. So generally above, say, 55, 60 degrees, ideal is in the 70s, but they'll start to replicate. These eggs will hatch. These larvae come out of hibernation or hiding in the crown of the plant, and then they will crawl up for the animals to ingest, to eat. So if I'm calving in February and March, and I brand the 1st of April, and I don't have green grass until June, these young animals don't have parasites. I don't need to do anything for those, right? And it's just what maybe overwintered in the cows, whether they were encysted or because the adults, they have a finite age lifespan, just like any other mammal. We don't think about it, but they have a lifespan. The longest living ones only are alive in the cow for, say, 5 or 6 months. The ones that cause us the most economic loss, Austratasia, they only live about 2 months. So the reality is, again, it does depend, right? So it depends on what species that I have the biggest problem with. What is the in my area or on my farm? I can go to a farm and test cattle that reside in one pasture compared to another pasture, say dry land, desert kind of environments, or the side of a mountain versus a hay meadow. And they will have completely different parasite profiles because the parasites, the amount of larvae on the pasture, let's say, on the irrigated, because it's perfect environment. The grass plants are close together. It's moist because they were irrigating it. We tend to graze those areas, like with the intensively managed pastures. We tend to graze them a little bit lower because now we're gonna graze them all the way down and we're gonna move them over and let this grow back up. Whereas out on dryland pasture, we tend not to graze them that hard. The grass plants are farther apart. Those little larvae can only crawl so far from a cow patty once they hatch and develop. So if there's not a plant there, they don't make it. So the risk is different. So one of the things that and there's a really long answer for what should be a good short question, but it really does depend. It depends on what parasites I'm dealing with, what month of the year I'm calving, and more specifically, what month of the year am I going to handle cattle? When am I branding? When am I turning out? What are my opportunities for touch points? What's the environment? Am I unirrigated or I'm out on the desert where I'm at? There's one cow for 30, 40 acres. Well, the chances of them running into some, material out there is completely different than on the irrigated pasture. Sometimes we have to manage cattle within our own operation as different groups because they face different risks. And so that's why it's really important to work with your local veterinarian. And using a product that works for when I can handle cattle or when I'm going to have the opportunity to treat them. So, and then spring and fall. Spring calving cattle are at a completely different risk point than fall calving cattle. And it depends on when are you going to calve? When are those calves going to be? So if I'm doing calves on dried out grass, let's say right now, and the temperature has been low, and so I've got very little hatch rate, those calves are not going to face a parasite load until next spring when they go to green grass. But if I'm calving in July, now the calves are getting exposed to that August, 1st of September time frame. So then maybe those calves have a completely different risk. You see what I'm saying? Mm. So there's a lot goes into it. One of the things that happened is when we got macrocyclic lactone. So ivermectin was the first macrocyclic lactone on the market back in 84, I think, or 85. And when we got those, we kind of stopped thinking about the parasite cycle and what's risk because it was so good. It was a game changer from what we had been using that we kind of thought, all we got to do is treat them. It doesn't matter what's happening. We'll just treat them. Mm-hmm. But the reality is we need to think in a broader picture right now, right? Parasites are co-evolved with their species that they are hosts. So parasites and bovids go way back before we do, right? There's lots of bovids before us. They've learned to evolve together. They've learned to live together. And now what we do is we come in as humans and we modify how animals live in their environment when they normally would calve, when they would, when they would normally wean their calves, and we modify it to meet our goals. And we forget about how does that affect maybe disease? How does that affect parasites? How does that affect flies? I mean, there's a lot of things that the way that we modify how we handle cattle, we have to think about it. It's everything's a positive and everything has a negative. We have to balance those, right?
Absolutely. So I just want to go back to a quote I'm taking from you from an article I read. I think that was in Beef Magazine or Drovers or one of the many. But so here's your direct quote. Instead of trying to eliminate all parasites, let's come up with an economically viable level of parasiticism the animals can live with physiologically and then manage to that point. So to me, this is, what we're trying to talk about today is really customizing and elevating our husbandry practices to fit our specific operation, which they're all different, like you touched on. So with that, let's move into SSQA, or species-specific quantitative analysis. So can you explain what that is and, its importance?
So it goes back to what we were just talking about, trying to design a protocol.
Yep.
Is in order to design a good protocol, I have to understand all of those components that we just talked about. When you're calving, what it looks like in relationship to green grass or in relationship to the larva. I need to know what the species are. I need to know who is at most risk on the operation. And that risk changes based on the species. So now after trying to say species specific quantitative analysis, you understand why we call it SSQA, but you can only say that so many times. So what it does is it tries to take a step back and look at a more holistic approach to parasite protocols and how we manage parasites. And you're right, that quote, we need to balance. We're not going to get rid of parasites. We had this in our mindset that somehow we could get to zero, and that is never going to happen. Never going to happen. They've been around a lot longer than us. So, like you said, we need to balance parasitism and economics. So I need to have a return on my investment. If I'm spending a certain amount of money to control parasites, I need to make sure that treatment or combination of treatments or timing of treatment, I need to make sure that that's returning the most dollars that it can to me, right? And not just do it because we have for the last, X number of years. That's what we always do. There are ways to rethink this thing. So that's kind of the basis of this, of SSQA. We do there's lots of tools in our toolbox for understanding parasitism. Fecal egg counts, that gives us a relative idea of how many eggs are being passed, or at least does the animal have parasites? It doesn't tell us a lot beyond that, because I can influence fecal egg count by when I take the sample or who I take the sample from. If I take a sample from a 10-year-old cow and I try and I compare it to a yearling heifer or a calf at weaning time, they're going to be completely different numbers, and they mean completely different things. It means something different based off of the parasite that's in there. So as an example, Ostratasia, the brown stomach worm, that parasite, internal parasite, costs us it is the most expensive parasite that we have. It can damage the abomasal wall. Those larvae have learned to evolve, because those are the ones that had the real short lifespan I was telling you about, 60, 90 days. So they had to figure out a way to, because they're short-lived, how do I get to the next generation at the right time? Well, they insist in the stomach wall, the abomasal wall, and they insist and they go dormant in there during times when their eggs would not hatch, or the larva would have a low survivability rate on the pasture. So they overwinter in those animals at that point in time. And then when it gets to be nice, they come out all at one time. And it's called type 2 ostratagiasis. And when they come out all at one time, they damage the glands in there that help digest protein. They damage the gastric glands, making the hydrochloric acid. Those animals can become permanently less efficient at digesting the food that we give them. So I need to here's one of the kickers is those things the females only lay 200 eggs a day. You go to the other extreme, a homunculus, which is the number one causing economic loss on the small ruminant side, sheep and goats, has some effect on cow calf side, but not to the extent of small ruminant. That female lays 10,000 eggs a day, and she lives to be about 6 months of age. So a fecal egg count that has 50 eggs in it means something completely different if they are Ostratasia, brown stomach worm, or are they homunculus, the barber pole worm. They mean something completely different, right? So what we've done is we say, okay, we're going to do these in herd units because we could test individually all these animals. And if I had enough cash, I would do that. And we'll get to that in a second. Economically, I just need to know kind of what's out there, what's being represented. I'm not necessarily treating individual animals anyway. I'm treating a group, right? So statistically, it has been demonstrated through research that if I take samples from 20 individuals within a herd unit, so 20 samples from calves, 20 samples from mature cows, 20 samples from yearlings or 2-year-olds, I can combine those at the lab and they will represent the group. And so I will get an average. I will not see the real highs and I won't see the real lows, but I'll get, here's what what the group is dealing with. Now, if I want to, we know that there's some genetic component to parasitism as well, and that's kind of going to long-term programs. But if I was doing individuals, I could select away from those high egg count and select more for the low egg count, which makes a big, and the sheep and goat side actually do that. The Katahdin industry basically has an EPD for rams for parasites, and they can breed a certain ram and reduce the parasite load on their offspring. So they've been dealing with the resistant thing longer than we have, so they're kind of a step ahead, right? But we can learn a lot. We can learn a lot from the sheep and goat folks. Anyway, so what we do is we take the fecal egg count. We do these herd unit, they're called composite samples. So we take these 20 samples, put them together, and then we do a fecal egg count 3 times on that group, on that composite. And that way, because there's some variability, not every speck of feces has the same number of eggs in it. So by blending them together, we try and get averages, and then we take an average of 3 different times so that we're not over or under representing it. If there's at least 10 eggs per gram in the sample, then we do what's called coproculture. Coproculture is where you incubate the eggs in the lab and get them to hatch, and then look at the larvae to determine what species those eggs are. 4 of the most important parasites that we have are called strongyles. They're in the strongyle family, Trichostrongylus to be specific. Their eggs all look the same under the microscope. So if I'm trying to if I'm measuring them, I might be able to be, fair. I might be able to pick out a few of them. But when you're looking at them at real-time speed and there's lots of them, you can't tell them apart. The 4 important ones: Cupuria, Ostratasia, homunculus, and Trichostrongylus. We can't tell them apart.
Okay.
So we have to do this culture, and then the larva, we can. The L3 larva, that's the stage that would infect the animal that crawls up on the grass for them to eat. But we can tell those apart looking at them under the microscope. So we collect those larvae, look at them under the microscope, determine what percentage is represented by each species within our sample, and then take that percentage and apply it back to the fecal egg count. So now what we're getting is basically trying to estimate the number of eggs of each species that were represented in that fecal egg count. Okay. So the point is, again, now if I can separate that homunculus from that Ostratasia, or the barbapole worm from the brown stomach worm, and I know that I have 50%, I have this fecal egg count of 20, and 50% of them, so 10 of them are represented by the brown stomach worm. Is that a significant number, right? It's not a perfect situation, but if I know that I've shifted the population from using one particular anthelmintic for a long period of time, and I've shifted the population in some way, say towards Cupuria, which is kind of how things go with macrocyclic lactone. Maybe I need to try something else, or I need to use a different combination or a different drug to address that specific parasite that has built up on my operation.
Mm-hmm.
So it allows me to do a better job of what is in those cattle, what's in each group of cattle. Because one thing we're finding, we know that mature cows develop immunity. So after about 4 years, they are not free of parasites, but their immune system kills most of the larvae that they eat. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, we had this thought about, well, if we put a macrocyclic lactone that lasts in their system for 20, 30 days, we can kill all these larvae out on pasture, right? They'll act as a vacuum, right? And we used to talk about them being a vacuum. The cows are doing that anyway. They didn't need the chemical. We don't need the chemical necessarily, unless those cows are parasitized. If they truly have enough, then yes, we need to treat them. But what we're finding with this SSQA program around the country is most of the time, mature cows may not need to be treated because of the low numbers. So she's killing those larvae herself, her immune system is. The immune system is also decreasing the ability of the adult larva in the GI tract, decreasing her ability to lay eggs. So not only does she have, say less parasites, but she's also passing less eggs into the environment. The young stock, on the other hand, they're very sensitive, especially calves. They've never seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
They get high egg counts, and they get a little bit of everything, and they're shedding lots of eggs. They kind of are responsible for building that larva curve later in the summer. And then in between gradations, yearlings are different than calves. Yearlings are different than 2-year-olds. 2-year-olds have less than, in general, these are general terms again. Generally, 2s have less than yearlings, and 3-year-olds have less than 2-year-olds. And then we get into these mature cows, and they're kind of all the same from 4 years up. So all we're trying to do with SSQA is do a better job of understanding what the cows have and at what level, and do we need to treat them? Because if I check and I say, well, you know what? Right now, it's not going to do me any good to treat, then why would I spend the money if it's not going to do me any good, right?
Right.
So we do take and we make some estimates. I can do a fecal egg count, like I was saying earlier. I could do it in April, and it means completely different than in June or July or October, right? I mean, because the parasites do different things in the body, and we don't necessarily take that into account often enough.
Well, I guess to go off a little bit further then with this, in Indiana and Kentucky, average cow herd size is, in 25 to 30. A lot of times we just go, all right, it's this time of year I buy my dewormer. I call my vet, or maybe I don't. Maybe I go to the local, feed supply company and I buy my dewormer there. But let's actually break back down into it, because if you really start to look at customizing to your operation, to your own cattle, to your own scenario, your own field that they're in, right? It's going to be different, like you just mentioned. So kind of what are some of the costs if, producers are looking for this SSQA, looking more in this direction?
So there is a herd size probably a herd size minimum where it's cost effective. It does. So the maximum right now is about $250 per herd unit to do everything. And that includes screening for flukes as well. Now, if we know we're not in the fluke area, then we can eliminate that. That saves some money. We don't very often get the full 250 per herd unit, but we can. That's kind of we usually like to do 4 units. So you could get $1,000 into all this testing, which sounds like an awful lot, right? However, the herds that we have that have been big enough, so 200 head or more, maybe even 175, if you start doing the math, if I had to do everything and I could save some money by doing it the correct wormer or the correct combination, I would say it's right in there. 175 to 200 head is really kind of where that cutoff is. Now, that said, there are some things we can learn by limiting it a little to somewhat. So if I just really need to know kind of what's out there, then one of the things would be, okay, let's just check calves. Let's just check calves right before weaning, kind of a thing. Maybe at preconditioning, if you have an opportunity to come through, you can collect samples out on pasture, but you need to see it fall from the animal because it has to be that fresh. Preferred is to take it right from the calf while it's in the chute or the cow. But I could do that, and I could do just the 1 unit rather than the rest of them, right? We could say, and maybe I just do fecal egg counts on my adult cows and make sure that they're below some threshold and don't do the rest of it. So there are ways to custom, I guess, because if I have the calves, they're the most likely to have all the parasites. They're going to have the broadest spectrum of parasites because they don't have any immunity to it. So if I did them, I could spend that amount of money and then I could make some educated adjustments to the protocol for everybody else, if that makes some sense. Working with the vet, it's another reason to, kind of talk. And I understand that there's those that don't necessarily have a regular veterinarian or don't, they're not on the place all the time and part of the protocol development. I understand that, but it is a good reason because the veterinarian is going to have, maybe, we work with some of the veterinarians too on how to maybe do some of this testing. And then, if they do a herd here and a herd there, pretty soon they can build a little bit of a map within their practice area and maybe be able to help make recommendations, going forward. So there's different strategies. You're exactly right. It's not for everybody just because of the cost, but I could target one group of animals and get a pretty good idea of what's going on in the herd, as a herd unit, what species are representative, maybe what drug, because that's the other thing we do with this is once we know those percentages and kind of what's out there, now I can kind of look at, well, when do you handle cattle? What are your touch points? What would be the best timing for an anthelmintic? Does that mean we need to use something that we can put in the mineral or as a creep, at certain times of the year because you don't have any other touch point? Or do I need, maybe if we're concerned about resistance, then we do things that what's called fecal egg count reduction test, where I tech an animal. Again, we got to use a certain number of animals, probably a minimum of 10. 20 would be better, but I could probably make some estimations with 10. And say, okay, I'm gonna do a fecal egg count, and then I'm gonna collect feces, and I'm gonna treat them with what my normal protocol is. And then 14 to 21 days later, I come back. If it was say it was a macrocyclic lactone, I would do 14 to 21 days later from the same animal, collect another sample, and do another fecal egg count. And we look at how much the egg count reduced from the first day till 21 days later, let's say. If it's not 90% reduction, that gives us some evidence that we do have, we have evidence for some reduction in efficacy, let's say, and so or resistance. At least, and we kind of use those interchangeably. We just say a lot of resistance, but I kind of think resistance is it doesn't have any effect, whereas reduction of efficacy is, well, it was 89%. Okay, maybe we're starting to see some early signs of resistance, but it did reduce it. Does that make so does that make some sense? So then what we do, if we do have evidence of resistance, then we can come in and say, okay, here's the species that were represented if we did the coproculture, and here's where the resistance lies. We dewormed them, and we saw that they had this population over here, but then they resulted with all the species that were left were one species. Now we know kind of where the resistance lies. I can take and design and say, okay, these two products or this product would be best to try and address that particular species. On the calf side of things, back to your point, Bill, if I've got small groups and I'm going to background some calves, or I have an opportunity ahead of weaning, even if you sell them right off the cow, but if I'm going to hold some of these calves myself and I'm trying to get some added gain on them, my personal opinion is because we've seen enough resistance or lack of reduced efficacy out there, let's do concurrent treatment on calves. So that's where we take a chemical from one class and give it at the same time as a chemical from another class. So an example would be using moxidectin, which is insidectin. Use that in combination with, say, oxbendazole or, in the benzimidazole class, or in combination with fenbendazole. If I have flukes, I could use albendazole because the albendazole will get the flukes, So we kind of can combine certain cross classes, even if there's reduced efficacy to either one. When you put the two together, the efficacy goes way up. So Dr. Kaplan at Georgia had done a lot of that work. There's other parasitologists that have done some of that kind of work as well. Yazwinski is another one that's done a lot of that. Looking at, when do we combine them, when do we not combine them? But Kaplan probably has done the most on combining and reducing resistance by combining those drugs.
So, how often does a guy need to do an SSQA? Is that a year, an annual thing, or what are your thoughts?
So again, that depends. We have one large operation that had been testing twice a year. But again, they're in a different situation because of the numbers. So any adjustments that they make a huge difference to the bottom line, at the end of the year, both how the cattle gained weight. And so they modify when we test and whatnot. I think for most people, if you did everything, or even if you split it up and you said, okay, I'm going to test everything just like we talked about. We're going to have 4 different groups. I know I'm going to take a big hit, but maybe I can modify a plan going forward. You could probably get away with one time. It would at least give you an idea of what's out there. Then I can monitor that with maybe just some plain fecal egg counts, not necessarily doing coprocultures. But the ideal scenario would be that I can get these samples off of the pasture, a month, 6 weeks ahead of time before I work cattle, so I know what to treat them with or which ones need treated and which ones don't, right? Mm-hmm. Like I said, gathering pasture samples have a challenge. It takes a lot of time out there following cows around, picking up fecal samples and, packing a cooler with ice packs. And there are challenges to doing it. So most of the time, most people just say, well, I'm going to do it at the shoot. Then we'll know what to do next time. Maybe we make a modification. We don't worry so much about, up front. The other option would be to, like I said, we do the calves first. Then maybe just to take a look at those cows, I do the cows that are outside of those calves. Because if I can see, and we see this all the time, the cows will be single digits, let's say, in a lot of areas, single digit fecal egg counts, and their calves will be 300, 200, 400. They're grazing the same grass, right? But that certainly demonstrates the power of the immune system when I do the cow and the calf, and I get those groups. We know that the young stock are going to be somewhere in the middle. The big question comes: am I in a fluke area? Do I need to find out when do I need to modify when I treat, or the chemicals I use in order to get after the fluke? So that becomes the big variable. But did that? I hope that helped a little bit. Again, it's one of those. It's a very complicated thing, and I think we've reduced parasite management to the point over the years of I just treat them. I just treat them when I brand them, and I treat them when I wean them, and it's good. That's all we got to do. Yep. The reality is, if I want to make money at this, I need to move that, or I may need to move that around. Maybe I eliminate the spring one because it's not doing me any good. I was going back to, we did some sampling this summer, and until we got in the north, this was Montana, the Dakotas, northern Nebraska, and Wyoming. Until we got into July, those calves didn't have very high egg counts, and they should have been the most susceptible, right? Mm-hmm. They should have gathered them. Well, it takes about 2 pre-patent periods. So a pre-patent period is from the time that an animal eats the larva out on the pasture until that larva develops in the body and becomes an egg-laying female. That's what we call pre-patent period. Okay. From larva to egg laying. It takes about 2 pre-patent periods before enough larvae build up, because it's not just like, all of a sudden I have parasites, right? Maybe I got one today and I get another handful tomorrow, and not all of them develop. So by the time you get to where there's enough of them that you can actually measure them, we're looking at 45 to 60 days if I really want an accurate understanding of what's out there and how many parasites. So if I'm doing fecal egg counts in 1st of June in Montana, probably doesn't mean a lot. If I'm doing fecal egg counts in Arkansas on the 1st of June, it means something completely different, right? Because the environment, or Kentucky, it means something completely different because their parasite season starts much earlier because it's warmer and wetter at a different time.
Absolutely. So Bill's going to get into talking about products here in a second. Okay. But before, Bill, you talk about that, what does procuring samples look like? How I'm imagining it is you take your little pickup out in the pasture, you've got a little kid with you with a bag and a shovel, and the adult has some beer, so we can just, because we're going to have to do some sitting and watching and waiting. But how does it look like in the storage of the samples?
Yeah, good question. So one, if we want, it's like anything. If we want really good results, we need to have really good inputs, right? So garbage in, garbage out. If we've involved too many adult beverages, we may not get the results that we hope for, right? So it is. What we do is we need a certain amount. So you need a sample about the size of an egg. Okay. And what I've done is, the little Dixie cups, the little paper Dixie cups. Yep. So they're about the right volume if I can scoop it. So I can take a Dixie cup, have on some glass, and maybe just scoop that Dixie cup full and then drop that Dixie cup into a Ziploc bag. And then the Ziploc bag goes into a cooler with ice packs in there to keep it cold, because we don't want those eggs to start developing. We don't want them to freeze because it damages the eggs and then they won't grow. In fact, sometimes we can't even see them when they split. So, and then we collect those 20 individually, but those 20 samples then end up in one bag for the herd unit. And it gets labeled with that herd unit: mature cows, suckling calves, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And then that gets mailed overnight. We are working with Texas A&M right now for getting these samples processed, just so that everything is standardized. Because when you start looking at different labs and different procedures, the results, there can be some variation in the results. Not that any one of them is wrong. It's just there's variation that sometimes makes it a little bit harder to interpret. So right now we're working with Texas A&M. We are involved in, because I look at those samples, I look at the results and help make interpretations. We've been doing some work with some veterinarians to help them kind of work through this so that they can send all these off. We just have to make all those arrangements. I still like to be in the loop just so that I can kind of see what's happening and maybe help if comes up a question, on the protocol. So that's out in the pasture. The easiest way is just to do it when we're processing cattle and then decide, okay, I'm going to modify my protocol next time. The frustrating part is if it was really my old protocol, then you go, oh, well, that didn't work. Now, do I bring them back in and do something different, or, do I just move forward? And I think for most of us, it's just, let's move forward, modify our program and move forward. Right. So we just do them at the chute. And so then it's just a matter of putting on your glove, grabbing a sample and putting it into the bag directly, as long as it's, a handful. The size of an egg, drop it in the bag. Same thing. We don't have to keep track of individuals unless there would be something that, that particular ranch or that veterinarian wanted to do a fecal egg count reduction, because a fecal egg count reduction needs to be on the same animal to do the math.
Sure.
We can do some herd unit things, but we have to be careful how we interpret fecal egg count reduction on a herd unit, because if I have one animal that I misdosed, or it didn't get the dose, or it's one of these that is a high egg count cow, it'll influence the result of the rest of that, if that makes some sense, especially on a fecal egg count reduction. So,
Well, so you're bringing back some of my memories of graduate school. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I had to do a lot of these at that point. But, we could always do an upsell here too, Jessica, and we could say, all right, Doc, we need to make sure you have some of our MVet exam gloves. And those are the best ones. Those are the best ones to take these samples with, and make sure you get them from me. But, I've also seen a situation where palpation sleeves can work as a glove or a bag that you can put them all down into. You tie it off, you put it in the cooler, and we in the large animal side seem to be pretty innovative when it comes to our solutions, I guess. But
yeah. Well, the thing about the sleeves, though, is it's great if I'm processing my own samples. If I'm sending them off to somebody else and I got to dig down in there with that spatula to try and get some, I'm probably not going to do your samples again, right? So we do have to take that into mind. That, hey, let's try and do what's going to be the best for the lab, because those guys are doing hundreds of these a day, and we got to watch out for them. But you're exactly right. There are the best practices on any of this stuff. So
yeah. So the next kind of series of questions here, we had some of our regional food animal specialists come up with, and I think we're starting to, before we talk about, resistance or efficacy, we're also starting to talk a little bit about super worms. Obviously on the agronomy side, we've been talking about some of the weeds that are becoming herbicide resistance, same types of conversations. So
sure.
What might be some of the newer products that are going to be hopefully coming to the market, to kind of combat these things?
So that's a good question. I really don't like the term superworm. I think we should call them what they are, and that is multi-drug resistant, basically, or just because it invokes some negative thoughts. I think when we actually stick them out there as the superbug, right? It's gonna wipe us out. So one, that is part of this, how the SSQA program and rethinking of how we manage parasites, and not thinking we're going to eliminate them. That is exactly what this your question led to these thoughts. I do not know of a brand new molecule on the horizon. Okay. We have recently seen a combination of two older products put together in a single product. But that's kind of our strategy right now. I mentioned Dr. Kaplan had talked about, there's this whole thought about rotation versus concomitant use, using two things at once, or do I just rotate? And there's been some others that do some computer modeling along with some testing. And it looks like you will get resistance to more than one class of drugs faster if you rotate them in some kind of a non-thought out plan, right? Just switching back and forth. As opposed to periodically putting the two together and then treating them, knocking out all those females and reducing some of those larvae in certain populations of the herd, and then or on the ones that I'm going to suffer the most loss, like the weaned calves. I'm going to put two drugs together on calves that I receive as a stocker, or on, especially if they come from areas where we know that maybe we have some multi-drug type reduced efficacy. Cross-class, when people talk about superbugs, they really think about they're resistant to more than one class of product. One of the things that we have to realize is we have basically three classes right now that we work with. Benzimidazoles, so that's your white wormers. It's easier just to remember that the white ones all fall into that benzimidazole class. And then macrocyclic lactones, which are anything that we pour on or inject right now in this country, with the exception of, there used to be a levamisole. That's an oral as well. And that's the third class. Imidazole. Yeah. Another nice word. But anyway, they're in a separate little group by themselves. Within the macrocyclic lactones, there's actually two subclasses, and we have to remember that. There's the avermectins, which include ivermectin, doramectin, and epinomectin. And then there's milbomycin, which moxidectin is the only chemical in that subclass. There's a reason that they're in separate classes, and that's because they're made by different yeast that we grow to create them. Some of the ones in the ivermectin class are man-made. We manipulate them a little bit from the original ivermectin in 1A and 1B. And then, but milbomycin is made by a completely different organism, and the core is the same. That's what gives it the macrocyclic lactone. But some of the side chains are completely different. And so it is unique, and it behaves differently than these other ones. So, back to the original question, it really is, if I understand what's out there, I cannot rely on 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to have a new product, because I'm going to lose economics for the next X amount of years. I need to plan, how do I manage these things to reduce the burden that my cattle have, and to make sure that the ones that they do have, I can treat them. And so that is, by understanding what's out there, by having refugia. We haven't talked about refugia yet, but that's where we leave 10 to 20% of the animals. We don't treat them, and we let them lay eggs out there, because those eggs that we're not treating, because anytime we treat the egg, nothing is 100%. We get really close nowadays when we put two drugs together, and we would get what looked like 100% with the very first year or two of ivermectin, but that ship sailed, like in 1988. After that, there's always a survivor, and those survivors are the ones that are packing the resistant gene or are less effective against, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that to go into. It's dose. Are they truly resistant to the chemical, or do we underdose them? Everybody doses for 1,250 pound cows, but there's very few 1,250 pound cows out there anymore, right? They're all 1,500 pounders. And so that's one way you get resistance, is continually underdosing. Same with antibiotics, right? So that's kind of that. It's even that question that you just asked. Is there something coming? No, but there are ways that we can use what we have. So, for instance, I remember Cydectin oral drench for sheep, and the injectable were like in 2005. Came out at about the same time in 2005. The original moxidectin was what, 1998, somewhere right in there, 98 or 2000 when it came to market. So we have not had a new molecule since then. Levamisole was being used in the 70s, and we used it up until we started getting till the ivermectin came on board, and then we kind of got away from it because we could do things with ivermectin at that point. So here we are, 18 years since even just a new form of moxidectin molecule. I wouldn't hold my breath on a new one.
I mean, honestly, so far after I'm just hearing this conversation, it to me, the answer is we need to be better just managing what we're managing on our own back 40, and I think we forget about that. I'm guilty myself. When we do our own cattle here, we deworm when it's more beneficial for us, right? We deworm when what's on sale, what's, and I hate to say that, but my own father, being a veterinarian, but that happens a lot. And sometimes I think that too, the veterinarians that I see on a daily basis, they buy more of who their favorite rep is or what product is giving them the best deal. And in the long run, that may not be at all benefiting the cattle producers that we're trying to get these products to and to have the control with. So
I would just add to what you said there, Bill, is exactly right. And it may not be that a particular molecule that somebody has on their shelf is wrong across the board. That's not what we're saying at all. It's going to be rancher to rancher as well. One person's been using one product forever and they treat every animal every time they get their hands on them. There could be some issues there, right? And you are exactly right with we have to start thinking not only on parasiticides, but fly control, antibiotic use, all of those things. When we put ear tags in, for crying out loud, we have to get away from this, what's convenient for me, and we need to start thinking what's more appropriate for the cattle, what's best for the cattle, and not what's convenient for me. If I'm a true cattleman, I'm looking at what is best for the cows, because what's best for the cattle generally gives me the biggest return on my investment. What's convenient for me rarely gives me the best. Rarely gives me the best return, right? Because I'm always fudging one way or the other. There may be a month later might be the better time, but that's not very convenient for me because I'm planting corn or something. Well, let's see if we can figure out a strategy that is better, tries to meet in the middle between those two so that we get a good return on investment. These things are not cheap. None of them are, right? Nothing we do is truly cheap, except maybe Clostridium vaccine. I mean, that one's fairly economical, right?
So, I mean, obviously you're with Elanco, so we want to acknowledge that. And, the products that you do have available, do you have some anecdotes from veterinarians or producers, kind of some success stories with your products and, their approaches in treatment?
So that is the one I really, when we had a couple of insecticides in Elanco prior to the acquisition of Bayer. But when we purchased Bayer, we got Cydectin and some of the other porons and the ear tags. And Elanco now actually has the largest parasiticide insecticide portfolio in the world. It's truly amazing the amount of stuff we've been able to put together. So some of the things that have come about, so there is that, there's some direct quotes actually from one of the producers that we worked with. It's in the June Feedlot Magazine parasiticide issue. And they interviewed me about, and then the producer as well in Texas about this SSQA program. that individual, by stressing, what we've tried to do is making sure that we're using the best product we can. So if I'm going to choose a macrocyclic lactone, the idea is to choose the best in class for the parasites that I have. And that's one of the beauties of the moxidectin and the sidectin molecule. They're using that one because of what they had on their place. They're also incorporating some of the other products in the benzimidazole class strategically at certain times of the year in certain groups of cattle. They have cattle that have some flukes and they have cattle that don't have flukes. Depends on the pasture. So we manage herd groups differently. They are convinced that they are measuring differences in how these calves perform in the feedlot based on what they are doing at the cow-calf level right now. And it makes sense, right? If I eliminate some of these encysted larvae at the right time in the abomasum, and I don't get the scarring, I don't get the damage, they, in theory, should be have improved feed efficiency, which makes me money, right?
Oh, yeah.
They have improved feed efficiency, have improved average daily gain or some. So there are, by doing it timing, it's not necessarily that, hey, there's no average daily gain on my label, but if I use them strategically, I should be able to maybe make them more efficient by getting rid of the parasites at the right time. The other thing is, that goes back to what Bill was talking about, convenient for me and best for the cattle. Sometimes we'll move a processing just a few weeks, and now I can do more than one thing, because we always say, I don't do this or I don't do that because it's too early. If I move it just a little bit, now maybe I can do deworming at a better time. I can do fly control at a better time. I can put ear tags in at a better time so that I get the most return on it. The more things that I do at one time, the better my return is, because now I'm getting better use of all of those products rather than putting a fly tag in, 30, 60 days before we actually get flies. And now they're starting to wear out by the time we get to the bloom, and then we suffer the fly bloom in July or August or whatever time it is for your region. So that would be one of the big things. Through this testing, another interesting thing about SSQA, we kind of wonder, because we've just been talking about how different all the regions of the country are, north, south, east, west, all these things are different. One of the common things that we keep seeing is this reduced shedding in cows. We did a group in Hawaii. The group in Hawaii had the same pattern.
Well, that's a conveniently beautiful place.
I didn't get to go. Wasn't me. There's a totem pole. I'm down here. But we saw the same exact pattern. So the cows that were grazing, and they did different groups. Cows, mature cows, 4 years and older on pasture. And I think of Hawaii, Florida, Arkansas, that kind of area. That's parasite heaven, right? Because it's warm most of the time, it's moist, and that's what parasites need. We saw the same exact pattern between Hawaii and Texas. And that is cows, mature cows, had fecal egg counts in the single digits. The calves that were grazing with those cows, suckling those cows, were in the 300 to 400 range. The 2-year-olds were right in the middle at like 60 or 55, something I'm trying to recall from memory. But that's the extreme difference. They were exactly the same pattern as we see in other places.
Interesting.
So we need to use that to our advantage, right? Mm-hmm. We need that information. And that's where this testing, if I can build this database on what's happening regionally, we should be able to work with the veterinarians and help them maybe improve the protocols that they're recommending, and those that don't, if we can get some of the stuff out, like your broadcast, and get people thinking about it. What can we do regionally if I don't have a regular veterinarian, or, I've got 50 cows. Do I do something different than the 500? Probably, but the principle is the same, right? So.
Absolutely. And before we go into these wrap-up questions, Bill, we recently had a food animal specialist meeting, and one of the topics was the Asian longhorn tick. And I know this wasn't in our questions, and I don't know why I didn't think to bring it up, but do you have any insight on that? Because that thing sounds kind of scary.
It is a little scary. The filariasis that Asian longhorn tick transmits, there is no treatment for it. And so we have seen some issues. You can see some abortions. You can see death laws. The tick itself, the downside is we don't have nobody. I say we, I mean the profession, entomologists and all that. We don't have specific data on any of these, a lot of these chemicals, because it's a foreign invader. It hasn't been here that long. We're doing research, blah, blah, blah. A lot of some of the macrocyclic lactones are being used down in the tick-free zone along Mexico as treatments. The biggest thing on ticks is you have to treat the environment and you have to treat the animal. And there's very specific, we try and not let cattle walk through, the brush and through the timber, and because that's where the tick's hideout is, on the edge. So, you may need to, if it's in your area, you may need to try and modify how we manage pastures. They do some pasture spraying to try on those edges to try and kill back the larvae that are out there. Well, we have to think about that, is because are we going to be getting non-targeted species that maybe are beneficial to us as well? So there's a lot of stuff that goes into these. And then frequency. If you think handling cattle twice a year to deworm them is bad, try handling them every, 2 to 4 weeks to treat them for ticks, right? I mean, those people that are in that zone in Texas are working cattle, every 21 to 42 days, trying to keep those numbers down, because they're treating the animal and they're spraying them. Ideally, we're looking at dip bats with either organophosphates, say like Corral. So that is a main one that the USDA actually uses. They have a different form of it. It's more concentrated, but it's the same. It's Coumaphos, and they're using that. So that's one of those that, if I am in a tick area and I have an opportunity to bring cattle through, I'm going to use the sprayer, and I'm going to put Corral in it. And I'm going to make sure I spray underneath the armpits. I'm going to spray between the legs. I'm going to spray under the tail head, around the perineum, the anus and the vulva. And, and behind the ears. I mean, where these ticks like to hang out, I'm going to make sure I spray them just to try and reduce the number that they have. That's, so there are some strategies, but it is a little scary, and it's moving all the time. It was here longer than we think it was. We thought it was only about a few years when we found it. But then after doing some DNA work on samples, we found that it had been here quite a bit longer, 4 or 5 or 6 years longer than we thought. So it's been here at least 10 years, and it's moving. The bad part is they don't even need males. They're parthenogenic. The females reproduce without males, and so far, to my knowledge, we have not found a male here in the United States.
That was my next comment. Oof.
Yep, they're all females. So, and they're small. They're hard. They're like a deer tick. They're small to see, and they look very similar. So people a lot of times will mistake them and think they're something else. So.
Yeah, I think that's definitely timely too. In one of my own accounts here in southern Indiana, right along the Indiana-Kentucky border on the Ohio River, we just recently had 2 head of cattle that died from the Asian longhorn tick, and the state came out and they searched the property, had their nets out there, and found them. And it is a problem, right? And so I was not expecting it to be in Indiana. These were some of the first cases in Indiana. So if it's here, right, what all is it covered between Florida and Indiana, or Texas and Indiana? And, we talk about it, I think, more on the small animal side than we do on the large animal side, but definitely going to be something to to think about. And I think it's almost hand in hand with our parasiticides and our insecticides, just on how we use them on our own operations. So I guess now what we're going to do is, just to wrap things up a little bit, you're going to have people that are listening out here to this podcast that are Midwest employees, whether they're outside, they're inside sales. We're going to be passing this out, spreading it out through the industry. So what are some ways that not only as sales reps, but as just individuals, we can, in the industry, how can we support our large animal veterinarian community and get better at what we're trying to do here?
So, yeah, that's interesting. From the, one of the biggest things I would say is vets are people too. So
Yeah.
I think we have to think about that just a little bit. It's a hard thing to think about, but veterinarians have one of the highest suicide rates of all professionals across the country. And when we have a failure, so one thing we don't think about as a producer is if I lose a patient, I feel it as a failure, or I feel it the same way that the producer does, whether it's a companion animal or whether it's a cow. It doesn't matter to me. I'm doing my best to try and save whatever animal it is. And so we as veterinarians take all of this stuff seriously, whether it's you've got a scours outbreak that's eating you up, or you've had a lot of BRD in your weaned cattle. We take it just as serious as you do and see it. So it doesn't do any good to scream and yell at each other over the fence sometimes, and I've had that happen. We need to do the best that we can to try and get around it, resolve an issue. Supporting the local vet is important. There are veterinarians that are in some areas that are making less than your postman, right? I mean, because of where they are. We don't go into this business to get rich. I know very few veterinarians that was the driver. That certainly had nothing to do with why I'm a veterinarian. I'm a veterinarian because I saw a need in helping animals that can't help themselves, right? They can't help themselves. They rely on us as humans. Anything that we have as a domesticated animal relies on us. And so that's how I got into it. So supporting the local vet, working with the local vets, making those connections. If I have a veterinarian that has a question on what's the best strategy, or what are some strategies for, parasite management, get them my way. Get them to the local Elanco rep. Use the connections that you folks have as sales reps out there to help get them to connected to a veterinarian. Just like you said earlier, Bill, we've got producers out there. There's a fair number of them that don't use veterinarians regularly. If they did, would some of the things that have happened in recent years be different? Would we have gotten the VFD at the same time we got a VFD? Would we have gotten all of our OTCs pulled when they happened at the same time? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a hypothetical, right? But I just know that sometimes these, sometimes the certain producers can look at some of the things that we have to do as veterinarians and say, wow, they're just toxicist after another $5 or what, and that's not necessarily the case. Health certificates are there to be able to track things like ticks, right? Like we talked about the Asian longhorn tick. If I'm doing a health certificate and I'm doing it correctly, hopefully I get my hands on a couple of those animals, or I look at them real close and I say, hey, these got ticks, they can't go, until I know what they are, right? I mean, and there's a paper trail thing. So all the things that we do they're not necessarily there as to be a resource, for me to make money. It's there to protect the entire food supply across the country and to protect other producers. If I willy-nilly let the cows get imported, because we move animals everywhere now, And if I willy-nilly let one of them out of Georgia or that has longhorn tick or now southern Indiana, and I let them go to the Dakotas, will some of those survive? I don't know. This thing is starting to creep north, right? So we thought it was going to come down the seaboard and stay south, but it's creeping north. So where's that line going to be? I don't know. So that's my, supporting is just trying to use the veterinarian. You're working with an individual rancher that maybe doesn't have a good history with the veterinarian, but help make that connection as a rep, right? Help make that connection rather than, not always working, I'm not saying anybody's working around, but you know what I mean? Make the connection so that both become better, so that producer maybe can see things in a slightly different light. You can, as we all need to try and look at this, take a step back and stop thinking about me and start thinking about, being good stewards, not only of the land and of our cattle, but of all these molecules that we have. That's part of this whole idea. And that's why some of these things have come about, the OTC thing. There are individuals that will abuse these things, all of these. And so we have to be careful about that.
Absolutely. So on a bit of a more lighthearted note, we want to cater to our vet students as well with this podcast. Yeah. And this is, I really would like to be a resource for them and, pass on the knowledge that you have and the experiences that you have and others like yourself. So what's something you'd want vet students to know, or some advice about going into the large animal practice? Any tips or tricks for success you got?
Well, it's not all puppies and kittens, right? I mean, emergencies happen. Emergencies are part of large animal practice. Emergencies are not always very convenient, right? And so
they never are.
No, I mean, they're not convenient for anybody, right? So it's not easy when so a rancher has a calving window of 60 days. A vet has a calving window of whatever, right? And so sometimes it's not easy to always show up with a smiling face, but as a new veterinarian, you really have to try to show up with a smiling face. You have to show up with some degree of compassion, some degree of understanding, and that not all animals, even on large operations, are a number. Some of them are very much have an emotional connection as well. I had a dairyman that had 2,000 to 2,500 cows, and every one of those was an emotional when something happened. And it's we think, you get to that size and it's just a number, right? We do the population medicine stuff and we make decisions. Yes, we make decisions that way, but it doesn't mean that it's not emotional. So we have to make sure that we understand that from our clients. And from the client standpoint, we have to make sure, like I said earlier, veterinarians, we also have a bit of an emotional connection. I take it personally when I cannot deliver a live calf. I take it personally when I can't save an individual animal. So we all have to kind of show up. I had a client that we had that kind of a relationship, and I'd be out there at 3 a.m. going to cut a calf and, cut a C-section, and it's smiles and good to see you, doc. Thanks for coming. I was happy to go. There was never, things happen. We get there and the calf is already gone by the time I get there. They never held anything against you as far as, hey, we should have had a live calf. No, we all did our best. And, so
it's the nature of
that's
the
probably one. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, it's just the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the industry.
It is, but we all need to, we do need to respect each other. We do need to not take things personally. Sometimes, you get out to a place, you don't know what happened, the day before somebody's grandma passed away. You don't know that. They're in a bad mood. I get it. The same happens to me, so we all got to try and that's the biggest thing I think for new grads. And just realizing that my expectations of time commitment to this practice or to this field may be different than what you had in mind. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of long days, but I'm working with like-minded people. I wouldn't trade a day of my practice, even the bad days, just because of we're working with like-minded people. I get to work outside. Some days outside is not so good. I mean, doing C-sections at 40 below is not very much fun, but
those are your character building days.
Yeah, they are. They also make you go, yeah, I don't know if I want to do this again. But if everybody is on the same page and we're all trying to help each other and we're all trying to do the best for the animal and try and take ourselves out of it for just a few minutes while we work, it's a win-win for everybody.
So let's get just one more kind of personal on level with you. What is your favorite breed of cattle?
My favorite breed of cattle is the one that fits the environment that they're destined to be in.
Well, that's a veterinarian answer if I ever heard one.
It's the right answer, because too many people try and raise cattle that do not belong in the environment they're trying to put them in because they're cute or they're whatever. All of these breeds have been developed to fit a certain niche, right? They all come from different parts of the world. Even the ones that we breed here ourselves, some of the combination ones, were bred for a specific environment. We need to find out. Sometimes we need to look at that history and go, what was the original intent of this animal? Because it's still packing those genes, even if they're kind of different than they are now. If I could run into some real economic problems if I take, an animal that is not going to fit my environment. Can I take an animal that's milking 40 pounds a day and put her on the desert in eastern Oregon and western Idaho and get her to milk 40 pounds a day, breed back, and bring in a calf that's got to weigh X amount? Ain't going to happen, right?
Right.
So I need to think about those kind of things. What was their intent? What's their genetic potential? And does it match my environment? There's a reason that those 10, 12, 14-year-old cows are still in your herd. And that is because they delivered, they fit your management, they fit your environment perfectly. Yeah. And that's why they're still there when they're that age. And so we need to make sure, we need to be observant enough and use identification enough, even on a small herd. I had lots of clients that I could see an ear tag when I'm preg checking this animal, and I knew how, where she came from because of the tagging system. I knew what year they were born. I knew what cow they came from by the tagging system. And when you start seeing 5 or 6 heifers out of a cow in the herd, then I know that was a good cow, right? That was the right cow for that environment, because every one of her daughters ended up in the deal. So, we have to again take a step back and look at the big picture.
Yep.
I can select for the highest CPDs, but that may not be the best thing for my operation.
That was an unexpectedly perfect answer. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
And then our very last question: what is one key point you want everyone to take away from this podcast of all the things we talked about?
Probably the biggest thing is just that we need, in a lot of different areas, but specifically to parasites, we need to take a step back and we need to rethink what we're doing. We have to change this paradigm of treating one and done kind of a thing. We have to go to the management side. And like the quote you pointed out, and I say it a lot, we need to manage cattle to some economic point, manage parasites to some economic point that we can live with and that our cattle can live with physiologically, so that we're both on the same page. That would be the biggest thing. And then to that end of looking at parasites in a completely different way, incorporating all these things like risk and species and timing and all that, realize that Elanco is here to help. Elanco is here to be part of that solution.